For 23 years, Lena Mercer carried a single belief in her heart like a wound that never healed. Her mother never loved her. She told herself that every missed birthday proved it. Every cold stare across the dinner table proved it. Every lonely night waiting beside the window while her mother disappeared for hours proved it. By the time Lena reached adulthood, she stopped searching for excuses. Some mothers were warm. Some mothers protected their children. And some mothers made you feel invisible even while standing inches away. That was the truth Lena accepted long before the funeral. But 3 days after Evelyn Mercer was buried beneath a gray Vermont sky, her daughter unlocked the front door of the old family house one final time. And within minutes, everything she believed about her mother began to collapse. Because hidden behind locked doors and rotting walls was evidence of another life. A secret life built around strangers whose names Lena had never heard before. Sick children, homeless veterans, grieving widows, families drowning in debt. Somehow, the cold woman who barely hugged her own daughter had spent decades quietly sacrificing herself for people she never even met. And the deeper Lena searched through that house, the more disturbing the mystery became. Why would a woman spend her life saving strangers while emotionally abandoning her own child? That question would lead Lena into a trail of hidden recordings, unfinished promises, and one final confession that her mother never lived long enough to explain. 3 days after the funeral, rain hammered the empty countryside roads as Lena drove toward the property she once swore never to see again. The house stood alone at the edge of a dying forest nearly 40 minutes outside town, isolated from neighbors and buried beneath towering pine trees that blocked most of the sunlight even during summer afternoons. Lena remembered those trees from childhood. She remembered staring at them through her bedroom window while waiting for headlights to appear in the driveway late at night. Sometimes her mother returned before midnight. Sometimes she didn't return until morning. And no matter how many times Lena asked where she had been, Evelyn always answered with the same cold silence that eventually became more painful than anger itself. As Lena stepped out of the car, funeral clothes still damp from the rain, she stared at the house with the same uneasy feeling she carried as a little girl. Time had changed almost nothing. The porch sagged lower now. The white paint had faded into gray, but the silence surrounding the property felt exactly the same. Heavy, empty, almost watchful. Before we go deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Lena climbed the porch steps slowly and pulled the rusted key from her coat pocket. The lawyer handed it to her immediately after the funeral service ended. No letter, no instructions, just a key and ownership papers for a house filled with memories she spent decades trying to escape. For a few seconds, she considered leaving. Selling the property untouched, walking away forever. But something kept her standing there in the rain with trembling hands. Maybe it was anger, maybe curiosity, or maybe deep down, a part of her still hoped she might finally understand why her mother spent an entire lifetime keeping her at a distance. The lock groaned as she turned the key. Dust drifted through the dark hallway the moment the door opened. The smell inside hit her immediately. Old paper, damp wood, forgotten years. The furniture remained exactly where it had been when she left at 25 years old. Even the clock above the fireplace was frozen at 9:17. Lena remembered that exact moment. A winter blackout during her teenage years. She remembered sitting in darkness while her mother silently lit candles without saying a word. Strange how certain memories survive while others disappear completely. At first, the house looked ordinary. Neglected, but ordinary. Then Lena noticed the boxes. Dozens of them lined the hallway walls from floor to ceiling. Some were sealed carefully with handwritten labels. Others looked partially packed as though someone planned to return and finish the job later. Lena crouched beside one marked Chicago. Inside were winter coats for children, still folded neatly inside plastic wrapping. Another box contained canned food, blankets, and handwritten cards with cash taped inside them. Another carried medical supplies and unopened pharmacy receipts. None of it made sense. Her mother struggled financially almost her entire life. Lena remembered overdue electricity notices sitting on the kitchen counter beside unpaid mortgage bills. She remembered hearing Evelyn cry quietly at night after believing everyone else was asleep. So how could a woman drowning in debt afford to buy supplies for strangers all over the country? As Lena moved deeper through the house, confusion slowly turned into something heavier. In the dining room, she discovered shelves packed with old notebooks. Every notebook contained names. Hundreds of names. Beside each name were addresses, medical details, financial notes, and personal reminders written carefully in blue ink. Lost husband in factory accident. Needs surgery before September. Children sleeping in vehicle. Avoid discussing military service. Lena flipped through pages faster and faster while trying to understand what she was seeing. These were not random notes. Her mother had been tracking people for years, helping them, following their lives in complete secrecy. The woman who forgot birthdays somehow remembered the medication schedules of strangers living thousands of miles away. Lena felt anger rising inside her again. If Evelyn cared this much about everyone else, then why did her own daughter grow up feeling completely alone? Then Lena noticed the locked door at the end of the hallway. She did not remember that door from childhood. The brass handle looked scratched badly, worn down from years of use. Something about it made her uneasy immediately. After several minutes searching through kitchen drawers, she finally found a small silver key taped beneath a cabinet shelf. The moment the lock clicked open, cold air drifted from the room beyond. Lena pushed the door slowly and froze where she stood. The room inside stretched farther than she expected, packed wall to wall with stacked boxes, photographs, and shelves overflowing with letters. Pictures covered one side of the room completely. Children smiling beside hospital beds. Elderly men standing outside shelters. Families gathered around Christmas trees. Every photograph included strangers Lena had never seen before. Another wall was covered entirely with handwritten thank you letters. Some were faded with age. Others looked recent. One read, "You gave us food when nobody else answered." Another said, "I still don't know why you helped me." Lena stepped farther inside with her heart pounding harder every second. Her mother had hidden an entire second life in this room. Then she heard the click. An old cassette player sitting on a nearby table suddenly turned itself on. Static crackled through the silence. Lena stopped breathing. For several seconds, there was nothing except faint background noise on the tape. Then a child's voice spoke softly through the speakers. "Thank you for saving my life." Lena's stomach dropped instantly because she recognized the voice. It belonged to her. Lena stared at the cassette player without moving, her pulse thundering so loudly she could barely hear the tape anymore. The voice had belonged to a little girl no older than 7 or 8. Soft, nervous, grateful. Her voice. There was no possibility of mistake. She reached toward the player slowly and pressed stop with shaking fingers. But the silence that followed felt even worse. Because now a terrifying question had entered her mind. Why would her mother keep a recording like that hidden inside a locked room nobody was ever supposed to find? Lena searched her memory desperately, trying to remember when those words were spoken, but nothing came back clearly. Childhood had become fragments over the years. Small moments buried beneath anger and distance. Yet hearing her younger self speak from an old cassette tape inside a secret room filled with strangers made her feel as though she had walked into somebody else's life entirely. The deeper Lena moved into the room, the stranger everything became. The boxes were organized almost obsessively. Every shelf carried labels sorted by states, dates, and handwritten symbols she did not understand. Some boxes had never been sealed completely, as though Evelyn planned to return and finish packing them before something interrupted her. Others looked ready for shipment, but were covered in dust thick enough to suggest they had been abandoned months earlier. Lena picked up a stack of old charity receipts clipped together with rubber bands, so old they snapped apart in her hands. Thousands of dollars had been donated over the years to shelters, medical funds, grief centers, and food programs across the country. The dates stretched back nearly 2 decades. One receipt showed Evelyn had donated money to help rebuild homes after hurricanes in Louisiana. Another funded chemotherapy treatments for a teenage boy in Ohio. Lena's confusion deepened into something almost painful. She remembered nights when the electricity inside this house barely stayed on. She remembered Evelyn wearing the same winter coat for 10 years because she refused to buy another one. So where had this money come from? And why did nobody know any of this existed? On another table, Lena found stacks of uncashed checks addressed back to Evelyn Mercer. Some were marked returned. Others had apology letters attached. One envelope contained a handwritten note from a pastor thanking Evelyn for paying heating bills for several struggling families during winter. Another included photographs of children opening Christmas presents beside a letter that read, You saved our family after my husband died. Lena sat down slowly in the middle of the room, overwhelmed by the growing contradiction between the mother she remembered and the woman described in these letters. For most of her life, Lena believed Evelyn simply did not care about people. Not deeply, not emotionally. Yet every inch of this hidden room suggested the exact opposite. The woman who rarely hugged her own daughter had apparently spent years carrying strangers through the worst moments of their lives. Then Lena noticed the journals. Dozens of them sat stacked neatly inside an old wooden cabinet against the wall. Each journal carried dates written carefully along the spine. 2003, 2004, 2005, all the way through the year Evelyn died. Lena opened the nearest one and immediately found pages filled with names circled in red ink. Beside every name were notes written in tight, hurried handwriting. Call before surgery. Lost insurance coverage. Check motel payment. Son attempted overdose. Some entries ended with simple words underlined repeatedly. Urgent. Critical. Alone. Lena turned pages faster, stunned by the emotional weight hidden inside these notebooks. Her mother had documented the suffering of strangers with more attention than she had ever given her own family. At least that was how it felt. But then Lena noticed something else. One sentence appeared again and again throughout nearly every journal. I'm running out of time. Sometimes it was written neatly in the margins. Other times it looked scratched into the paper aggressively, almost desperate. On certain pages the sentence appeared 3 or 4 times in a row as though Evelyn had been trying to remind herself of something she feared forgetting. Lena felt coldness spread through her chest. Running out of time for what? Illness? Debt? Some kind of danger? She searched for explanations inside the journals, but the entries only became stranger the farther she read. Entire pages had been ripped out. Some names were blacked over heavily with marker. Others were crossed out completely beside dates and addresses from states Evelyn had supposedly never visited. Then Lena found the photographs. Hundreds of them were packed loosely inside a cardboard box beneath the desk. Most showed strangers smiling beside Evelyn in hospitals, shelters, churches, or apartment buildings. In almost every picture, her mother looked different from the woman Lena remembered at home. Softer somehow. Alive. There was warmth in her eyes Lena had never seen growing up. But mixed among those photographs were burned pictures too. The edges were charred black, as though somebody had tried to destroy them but stopped halfway through. One showed Evelyn standing beside an older man Lena did not recognize. Another showed a teenage girl holding flowers outside what looked like a cemetery. On the back of one burned photograph, somebody had written a single sentence in faded blue ink. She can never know. Lena stared at those words for several seconds without blinking. A feeling she could not explain settled over the room. Not fear exactly. Something worse. The growing realization that her mother had spent years hiding pieces of herself from everyone around her, including her own daughter. And the more Lena uncovered, the clearer it became that this house was not simply filled with unfinished charity work. It was filled with secrets. Then she opened the final journal sitting alone at the bottom of the cabinet. The moment she turned the first page, her entire body went still. Written across the paper in thick black ink was her own childhood name, Lena, and beneath it, violently scratched over and over again until the page nearly tore apart. A giant black X. Lena could not stop staring at her own name scratched violently across the journal page. The black ink had cut so deeply into the paper it nearly tore through to the next sheet beneath it. For several seconds, she simply sat there in silence, trying to understand what she was looking at. Her mother had written thousands of careful notes about strangers with patience and precision. Yet here, beside Lena's own name, there was only rage or grief or panic pressed into the paper hard enough to damage it permanently. She turned the page slowly, expecting an explanation, but most of the following entries had been ripped out entirely. Only fragments remained. Partial sentences, dates, references to hospital visits and phone calls she could not piece together. The more Lena searched for answers, the more she felt as though her mother had spent years building walls around the truth. At 48 years old, Lena Mercer had become someone who trusted distance more than love. Divorce had only reinforced what childhood already taught her. People eventually disappoint you. Her marriage lasted 14 years before collapsing quietly under the weight of emotional exhaustion neither she nor her husband knew how to fix. He once told her she treated affection like a negotiation instead of a feeling. Lena hated him for saying it at the time because deep down she understood exactly where she learned it. Growing up inside Evelyn Mercer's house felt like living beside a locked door that never fully opened no matter how hard you knocked. Her mother provided food, shelter, clean clothes, and strict routines, but warmth was rare. Conversations were short, hugs almost non-existent. Every emotional need Lena expressed seemed to disappear into silence. Some of her clearest childhood memories were built around waiting. Waiting beside classroom windows after school plays while other parents hugged their children in crowded parking lots. Waiting through birthdays where Evelyn arrived home hours late carrying rushed apologies and grocery store cakes. Waiting at the dinner table through endless quiet meals where forks scraping against plates became louder than conversation itself. Lena remembered trying desperately to make her mother laugh sometimes, telling stories from school or repeating jokes she heard from friends, only to watch Evelyn nod absently while staring somewhere far away. It created a loneliness that followed Lena long after childhood ended. Some parents hurt you with violence. Others hurt you with absence. And absence leaves behind questions that grow heavier with age because there is never a single moment you can point to and say, "That was when everything broke." What disturbed Lena most now was realizing that while she spent years believing her mother simply did not care deeply about anyone, the hidden room upstairs suggested the opposite. Somehow Evelyn Mercer had found enormous compassion for strangers while leaving her own daughter emotionally starving. That contradiction sat like a weight in Lena's chest as she searched deeper through the journals and receipts scattered across the room. By midnight, rain still hammered against the windows while Lena moved through the house, carrying stacks of documents into the kitchen. She began organizing them across the old dining table, trying to create some kind of timeline from the chaos. The receipts alone stretched back nearly 20 years. Food programs in Ohio, shelter donations in Michigan, hospital payments in Pennsylvania, emergency motel stays in Kentucky. Every time Lena believed she had reached the end, another envelope revealed even more. What shocked her most was the amounts. Evelyn had donated staggering portions of her income despite living in near poverty herself. Lena found years where her mother gave away almost everything beyond basic survival expenses. There were months Evelyn appeared to have emptied entire bank accounts helping complete strangers. And suddenly memories Lena had buried for years began returning differently. The broken furnace during winter, the overdue mortgage notices, the electricity shutoffs, the arguments about money. All those years Lena believed her mother was irresponsible or careless. But what if Evelyn had been giving everything away in secret? That realization unsettled her more than anger ever had. Because if it was true, then her mother's entire life had been hidden behind silence. Around 2 in the morning, Lena stepped outside for air. The rain had weakened into a cold mist drifting through the trees surrounding the property. Across the road, a porch light glowed faintly from the nearest neighboring house. After a moment of hesitation, Lena crossed the muddy gravel road and knocked quietly. An elderly man answered after several seconds, studying her face carefully before recognition spread across his expression. "Lena," he asked softly, "I haven't seen you in years." His name was Walter Briggs. He had lived beside the Mercer property for nearly 40 years. Lena remembered him vaguely from childhood as the quiet widower who fixed lawnmowers in his garage and waved politely from a distance. He invited her inside immediately once he learned Evelyn had passed away. The moment Lena mentioned the boxes and journals hidden inside the house, Walter's expression changed. "I always knew your mother was helping people," he admitted carefully. "But I don't think anybody understood how much." Lena frowned. "Helping who?" Walter leaned back slowly in his chair. "Anybody who needed it. Veterans, families, sick kids, folks losing their homes. Your mother was always driving somewhere late at night, always carrying groceries or medicine or blankets." Lena felt irritation rising immediately. She barely had enough money to take care of herself. Walter nodded quietly. "That's true. Then why would she spend decades taking care of strangers?" The old man looked toward the window before answering. "I don't think your mother knew how to stop once she started." The conversation disturbed Lena deeply because it clashed violently with every memory she carried growing up. But Walter was not the only neighbor with stories. The following day, she visited others nearby. Some described Evelyn Mercer almost like a saint, a woman who quietly paid heating bills during harsh winters and left groceries on porches anonymously. Others reacted differently. One woman lowered her voice and admitted, "Nobody really knew what your mother was doing half the time." Another neighbor recalled seeing unfamiliar people arriving at the house late at night for years. Some stayed only minutes. Others remained for hours. Rumors spread constantly through the small town. Affairs, gambling, secret debts. Nobody knew the truth because Evelyn never explained herself to anyone. And that secrecy slowly became the center of Lena's growing obsession. That evening she returned to the hidden room and searched through another stack of financial records tucked inside an old filing cabinet. Most were ordinary receipts until she found a bundle tied carefully with faded blue ribbon. These documents were different. Detailed bank statements, withdrawal records, donation summaries. Lena read them slowly, her stomach tightening more with every page. The evidence was undeniable now. For almost 20 years, Evelyn Mercer had donated nearly everything she earned. Sometimes over half her monthly income disappeared into charities, medical funds, emergency housing programs, or private payments sent directly to struggling families. The amounts became larger over time, even as Evelyn's own financial situation collapsed. Then Lena found one final receipt near the bottom of the stack. The date froze her completely, because it matched the exact same week her college tuition payment failed years earlier. The same week Lena dropped out after believing her mother simply refused to help her. Lena sat frozen at the dining table long after midnight, staring at the tuition receipt while rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows. For years, she believed that week represented the final proof her mother did not care about her future. She remembered the humiliation of packing her belongings from the college dorm after the payment failed to process. She remembered calling Evelyn repeatedly and getting no answer. And most painfully, she remembered standing outside the financial office convincing herself she was completely alone in the world. That moment shaped everything that came after. It was the reason she stopped trusting people completely. The reason she built emotional distance into every relationship she ever had. Yet now, sitting inside the same house she once escaped from, Lena discovered that during the exact week her tuition went unpaid, Evelyn Mercer had quietly transferred thousands of dollars to strangers she had never met. The discovery should have made Lena furious. Instead, it left her deeply unsettled because anger was becoming harder to hold on to. Every answer uncovered another contradiction. Every document revealed a woman she no longer recognized. The next morning, Lena made a decision she could not fully explain even to herself. She started tracking the names from the journals. At first it felt irrational, almost intrusive, but she needed to understand why her mother spent decades pouring herself into the lives of strangers while remaining emotionally absent from her own daughter's life. The first name she searched belonged to a retired Army veteran named Daniel Harper living outside Pittsburgh. Evelyn's notes beside his name stretched across multiple years. Missed appointment. Nightmares worsening. Needs surgery before winter. Lena drove 4 hours through heavy rain carrying one of the folders she found inside the hidden room. Daniel answered the door slowly with a cane in one hand and confusion written across his face the moment Lena introduced herself. When she mentioned Evelyn Mercer, the old veteran became silent for several seconds. "I wondered what happened to her," he finally said quietly. Daniel explained that years earlier he lost most of his mobility after complications from spinal injuries connected to military service. His insurance denied several procedures he desperately needed. He spent nearly 2 years trapped inside a small apartment, unable to work, while debt piled higher every month. Then one day a woman named Evelyn contacted the hospital anonymously and paid for part of the surgery costs. She never asked for recognition. Never even met him in person until months later after he recovered enough to walk again. "She saved my life," Daniel admitted while staring down at his trembling hands. "I was getting ready to end things before she stepped in." Lena listened in silence while trying to process the weight of those words. The man sitting across from her spoke about Evelyn with warmth and gratitude she never experienced herself growing up. Yet even while hearing his story, another painful thought kept surfacing in Lena's mind. Her mother found ways to save strangers from despair, but somehow never realized her own daughter spent years feeling emotionally abandoned under the same roof. That contradiction followed Lena everywhere over the next several days. Each name from the journals opened another hidden chapter of Evelyn's life. In Ohio, Lena located a woman named Teresa Vaughn who once lived homeless with her 2 daughters after fleeing an abusive marriage. Teresa explained that an anonymous donor paid for a small apartment where they stayed nearly 8 months while rebuilding their lives. That woman gave us a chance to breathe again, Teresa whispered with tears filling her eyes. I never even understood why she cared. In another journal entry, Lena discovered records connected to a teenage boy named Caleb Turner from Missouri. Evelyn had partially funded leukemia treatments after his family exhausted their savings traveling between hospitals. Caleb's father described Evelyn as the only stranger who kept calling after everyone else disappeared. He even showed Lena old voicemail recordings where Evelyn checked constantly on Caleb's condition late at night. Late at night. Those words echoed inside Lena's mind constantly now because they matched the exact periods from childhood when Evelyn vanished from the house for hours at a time. For decades, Lena assumed her mother was hiding an affair, addiction, or second family. She remembered lying awake listening for headlights in the driveway while imagining terrible possibilities inside her young mind. But now the truth emerging from these journals felt far more complicated than anything she imagined. Evelyn Mercer had apparently spent most nights driving across towns and states helping people survive crises they could not escape alone. And still the central question remained unanswered. Why did a woman capable of such compassion leave her own daughter emotionally starving for affection? As the days passed, Lena became consumed by the investigation. Sleep disappeared almost entirely. She spent nights surrounded by photographs, receipts, and tape recordings while trying desperately to connect the fragments of Evelyn's hidden life into something understandable. Coffee cups piled beside stacks of journals across the kitchen table. Sometimes she stayed awake until sunrise replaying cassette tapes over and over searching for clues hidden beneath ordinary conversations. Other times she wandered through dark hallways carrying only a flashlight while dust drifted through the beams like floating ash. Slowly, the house itself began feeling less like a home and more like evidence. Every room contained unfinished promises. Every drawer hid another secret. It became painfully clear that Evelyn Mercer spent her entire life trying to redeem something she never spoke about. And whatever haunted her followed her to the grave. One evening, Lena discovered another locked door behind shelves in the basement storage area. The hinges groaned loudly when she forced it open. Inside was a narrow room packed floor to ceiling with carefully wrapped boxes. At first, she assumed they were more charity supplies until she noticed the labels written across each package. Age 6, Age 7, Age 8, Age 9. Her breathing slowed instantly. Lena stepped closer with trembling hands and opened the nearest box carefully. Inside was a dollhouse she once begged for during childhood after seeing it displayed in a department store window near Christmas. Another box contained roller skates. Another held books she remembered pointing at during school shopping trips. One after another, the gifts revealed pieces of her childhood Evelyn somehow remembered in exact detail. Every birthday, every year, every present unopened. Lena felt something inside her beginning to crack. Because the boxes proved something she never allowed herself to believe. Her mother had remembered everything. For years, Lena convinced herself she did not matter to Evelyn Mercer. That she was forgotten the moment birthdays passed or school events ended without her mother appearing. Yet hidden beneath decades of dust were physical reminders that Evelyn tracked every single year of her daughter's life in complete silence. But why keep the gifts hidden? Why buy them and never give them away? Lena opened another box slowly, her hands shaking harder now. Beneath folded wrapping paper and an unopened birthday card rested a large white envelope stamped with hospital markings. Across the front, written in Evelyn's handwriting, were 4 words. Do not ignore this. The envelope had never been opened. Lena stared at the hospital envelope for nearly a full minute before finally opening it. Her fingers moved carefully, almost reluctantly, as though some part of her already understood that whatever waited inside would change the entire shape of her memories forever. The paper inside was old and slightly yellowed around the edges. Several medical forms were clipped together with notes written in different handwriting. At the top of the first page sat Evelyn Mercer's full name beside a diagnosis date from nearly 16 years earlier. Lena's eyes moved slowly across the words until they stopped completely on one phrase. Terminal degenerative neurological disorder. For several seconds, she could not breathe properly. She kept reading. The illness was progressive, irreversible. Doctors estimated gradual cognitive and physical decline over time. One specialist described the condition as emotionally destabilizing for both patient and family members. Another recommended long-term care planning and psychological counseling for immediate relatives. Lena sank onto the basement floor while the papers trembled violently in her hands. 16 years. Her mother had known she was dying for 16 years. Long before Lena's divorce. Long before the missed tuition payments. Long before the years of silence hardened permanently between them. Suddenly, the repeated sentence from the journals echoed through her mind with crushing force. I'm running out of time. It had never been metaphorical. Evelyn was literally counting down her remaining years. Lena leaned against the wall and closed her eyes as memories began rearranging themselves in painful new ways. The late nights, the emotional distance, the strange coldness that defined her mother's behavior. For most of her life, Lena interpreted those things as rejection. But now another possibility emerged, one almost harder to accept. What if Evelyn had been preparing her for abandonment long before death arrived? What if every moment of distance had been intentional? Inside the envelope, Lena found additional documents from therapy consultations dated years apart. One sentence appeared repeatedly throughout the notes. Patient expresses fear of daughter developing emotional dependency. Another line stopped Lena cold. Patient believes emotional separation may increase daughter's long-term resilience following inevitable decline. Lena lowered the papers slowly, her chest tightening with confusion and anger. The realization felt impossible to process emotionally because it forced two contradictory truths to exist at once. Evelyn Mercer clearly loved her daughter far more deeply than Lena ever imagined. But at the same time, she deliberately chose emotional distance as a form of protection. Somewhere in her deteriorating mind, Evelyn convinced herself that teaching Lena how to survive without affection would somehow make losing her easier one day. And that idea horrified Lena almost as much as the years of silence themselves. Because what kind of parent convinces themselves that withholding love is an act of love? The discovery transformed the investigation completely. The hidden room no longer looked like evidence of secret generosity alone. It looked like the desperate work of a woman trying to outrun death while controlling the damage she believed her illness would eventually cause. Every donation, every late-night trip, every unfinished charity project suddenly carried a different emotional weight. Evelyn Mercer was not simply helping strangers. She was trying to leave behind proof that her life mattered before time disappeared completely. But even with that understanding, the emotional conflict only deepened. Because another question now haunted Lena relentlessly. Did her mother sacrifice closeness because she genuinely believed it would protect her daughter? Or was that explanation simply easier than confronting her inability to express love normally? That question became impossible to ignore as Lena continued reading through Evelyn's medical notes late into the night. Several evaluations referenced Evelyn's own childhood trauma, abandonment, emotional neglect, a father described as withdrawn and punitive, a mother who reportedly disappeared for weeks during depressive episodes. One therapist wrote that Evelyn displayed severe difficulty forming emotionally secure attachments despite intense feelings of responsibility toward others. Another observation struck Lena especially hard. Patient equates practical sacrifice with emotional affection, demonstrates discomfort with direct vulnerability. Lena sat quietly for a long time after reading those words because they explained something she had never understood growing up. Evelyn Mercer could provide food, shelter, money, medicine, and endless acts of service to complete strangers. But when it came to simple emotional intimacy, she froze completely. It was as though caring for people through sacrifice felt safer than speaking honestly about love itself. Over the following days, Lena contacted several psychologists whose articles discussed generational trauma and emotional repression. She wanted outside perspectives because the truth unfolding inside the house felt emotionally overwhelming. One specialist explained that some parents raised in emotionally barren environments confuse survival with strength. They convince themselves that emotional detachment builds resilience instead of loneliness. People repeat the only love language they were taught, the psychologist told her carefully. Sometimes they believe suffering prepares children for reality, especially if they survived painful childhoods themselves. Another expert described parents who replace emotional connection with acts of sacrifice because vulnerability feels terrifying to them. They provide financially. They rescue others. They solve problems constantly. But emotionally, They remain unreachable because intimacy triggers fear they never resolved. Every explanation helped Lena understand Evelyn more clearly, and yet none of it erased the damage. That became the unbearable complexity sitting at the center of everything. Evelyn Mercer may have loved her daughter deeply. She may have spent years believing emotional distance would protect Lena from future grief. But intentions did not erase consequences. Lena still grew up feeling unwanted, still carried decades of resentment into adulthood, still built her entire emotional identity around the belief that love eventually disappears. The deeper Lena searched for understanding, the less simple the story became. Some nights, she felt overwhelming sympathy for her mother. Other nights, anger returned stronger than ever. Because hidden beneath every charitable act and medical explanation remained one undeniable truth. Evelyn Mercer made choices. She chose silence repeatedly when honesty might have changed everything between them. And still, even after uncovering the diagnosis, the house continued hiding secrets. One evening while reorganizing the journals chronologically across the dining room table, Lena noticed something strange. The sequence skipped an entire year. Every notebook from 2003 through 2021 was present except one. At first she assumed she misplaced it among the stacks. But after searching the house for hours, panic slowly settled into her chest. The missing year was impossible to ignore because according to the medical records, 2014 marked the point when Evelyn's condition began worsening rapidly. Lena returned to the hidden room near midnight and searched more aggressively this time. She checked beneath floorboards, inside cabinets, behind photographs. Dust coated her hands while flashlight beams cut through darkness across the walls. Then she noticed faint rectangular marks beside one bookshelf, almost like something large had been removed recently. Her pulse quickened, because somebody had taken the final notebook. And whatever Evelyn recorded during that missing year was important enough to hide completely. The moment Lena realized the 2014 notebook was missing, the entire investigation changed again. Up until then, she believed she was uncovering forgotten pieces of Evelyn Mercer's hidden life, one by one. But now it became painfully obvious that some secrets inside the house had been intentionally concealed. Someone had removed that notebook recently enough to leave clean marks behind the bookshelf where dust had not yet settled evenly. Lena stood in the hidden room long after midnight, staring at the empty rectangular space while questions raced through her mind. If the notebook documented the period when Evelyn's illness began worsening, then what exactly had she written inside it that mattered enough to hide? And more importantly, who hid it? Sleep became impossible after that. For the next several days, Lena moved through the house with growing obsession, searching every room for anything connected to the missing year. Cabinets were emptied onto floors. Old closets were dismantled. She even searched the attic beneath collapsing insulation while cold rain hammered against the roof overhead. During one of those searches, she discovered a small tin box hidden beneath loose floorboards in Evelyn's bedroom closet. Inside were 3 rusted keys attached to faded labels written in her mother's handwriting. One read storage. Another read archives. The final key carried only a simple drawing of a lighthouse. That symbol again. Lena had already noticed the lighthouse appearing repeatedly throughout Evelyn's journals. Small sketches in notebook corners. Tiny symbols beside certain names. At first she assumed it meant nothing. But now the image felt deliberate. Important. The second discovery came later that same evening. Behind stacks of old winter coats inside the basement, Lena uncovered a locked metal filing cabinet she had somehow overlooked earlier. One of the rusted keys opened it immediately. Inside were secret bank records dating back nearly 15 years. Several accounts existed entirely outside Evelyn's primary finances. Large withdrawals moved between organizations Lena did not recognize. Some transfers were marked with handwritten notes beside them. Final phase. Property discussion. Children's housing approval pending. The deeper Lena searched through the records, the clearer it became that Evelyn had been planning something massive during the final years of her life. Then Lena found the letters. Dozens of them. Every envelope remained sealed and undelivered. Some were addressed to churches, others to shelters, hospitals, legal offices, and community organizations across multiple states. Most discussed funding proposals, property agreements, or long-term care plans. A few referenced the Lighthouse Project repeatedly, but nowhere did Evelyn clearly explain what that project actually was. The letters stopped abruptly only months before her death, as though the entire plan suddenly collapsed before completion. One unfinished draft caught Lena's attention immediately. If the property transfer is approved before my condition worsens, the children can move in by autumn. Children, move in where? Lena read the sentence repeatedly while confusion tightened inside her chest. The old house suddenly felt different around her, less like a private residence and more like part of something unfinished. That night, she played more of Evelyn's cassette recordings, hoping to find answers hidden inside the tapes. Most recordings contained conversations with struggling families, medical coordinators, or quiet personal reminders spoken into the recorder late at night when Evelyn sounded exhausted. But one tape stopped Lena completely. Her mother's voice sounded weaker than usual, slower and strained beneath heavy breathing. "If I can finish this before time runs out," Evelyn whispered into the recorder, "then maybe none of them will grow up alone." The tape ended abruptly after those words. Lena replayed the recording 4 times in complete silence. None of them. Not her. Them. Who was Evelyn trying to save? The following morning, Lena left Vermont again and began following the remaining clues across neighboring towns and cities. The journals led her through churches where volunteers remembered Evelyn arriving with anonymous donations during harsh winters. Shelter coordinators described a quiet woman who refused public recognition despite funding emergency housing programs for struggling families. At hospitals, Lena found records showing Evelyn paid portions of treatment costs for terminally ill children whose parents could no longer afford care. Everywhere Lena traveled, people remembered her mother differently than she did. Compassionate, tireless, generous almost to the point of self-destruction. Yet even while hearing these stories, another unsettling detail kept surfacing repeatedly. The lighthouse symbol. Lena saw it painted on old bulletin boards inside shelters, printed faintly on charity forms, stamped onto folders tucked inside hospital archives. One elderly pastor recognized it immediately when Lena showed him a sketch copied from Evelyn's notebook. "You don't know about the lighthouse camp?" he asked quietly. Lena shook her head. The pastor explained that years earlier several churches and local charities attempted to create a retreat center for grieving children, especially children who lost parents to illness, addiction, military service, or abandonment. The project struggled financially for years before eventually collapsing. According to him, one anonymous donor spent nearly a decade trying to revive it privately after public funding disappeared. That donor was Evelyn Mercer. The realization hit Lena harder than almost anything else she discovered so far. Her mother had spent years trying to build a place specifically for grieving children, while her own daughter grew up emotionally isolated under the same roof. Again, the contradiction returned. Again, the emotional conflict deepened. How could a woman understand loneliness deeply enough to dedicate her life helping abandoned children, yet fail to recognize it inside her own home? Lena drove 3 hours that evening to visit the abandoned property once intended for the lighthouse camp. The building sat hidden beside a lake surrounded by tall pine trees and overgrown trails. Most structures were unfinished. Some remained only wooden frames exposed to years of weather damage. But even in decay, the vision behind the place felt painfully clear. Dormitories for children, counseling rooms, community kitchens, art spaces, areas designed for healing. Near the entrance, Lena found an old sign collapsed into weeds. Lighthouse Family Retreat. Beneath the faded title was a phrase partially erased by rain and time. No child should grieve alone. Lena stood there for a long time, unable to move, because suddenly everything inside Evelyn's journals started connecting together. The donations, the late-night disappearances, the secret accounts, the endless tracking of struggling families. Her mother had not simply been helping random strangers. She had been trying desperately to finish one final project before her illness consumed her completely. A sanctuary for people living through the exact loneliness she feared most. That realization followed Lena back to the house late that night. Exhausted and emotionally numb, she returned once more to the hidden room upstairs. Something about the missing notebook still bothered her deeply. The rectangular gap behind the bookshelf felt intentional in a way she could not ignore. This time she examined the wall itself more carefully. After several minutes, her fingers brushed against a narrow seam hidden behind loose wallpaper near the floor. Her heartbeat quickened instantly. She pressed harder. A small wooden panel shifted open. Behind it sat the missing 2014 notebook wrapped carefully in cloth. Lena pulled it out slowly, dust coating her hands. Inside the notebook rested a sealed envelope. On the front, written clearly in Evelyn Mercer's handwriting, were 4 words. For my daughter, Lena. Lena stared at the letter without opening it. Rain returned sometime after midnight, striking the windows with a steady rhythm that filled the silence inside the house. Lena remained seated on the floor of the hidden room with the sealed envelope resting in her hands. For nearly an hour, she could not bring herself to open it. Part of her feared the letter would destroy the fragile understanding she had spent days building. Another part feared it would do something worse. Forgive her mother too easily. The investigation had already unraveled almost everything Lena believed about Evelyn Mercer, yet one painful truth still remained untouched beneath all the revelations. No matter how tragic her mother's illness was, no matter how many strangers she saved, Lena still grew up feeling unwanted. And once a child carries that feeling long enough, it becomes difficult to separate memory from identity. The envelope felt strangely heavy as Lena finally broke the seal. Inside were nearly 20 handwritten pages folded carefully together. The handwriting shifted throughout the letter. Some sections appeared neat and controlled while others trembled unevenly, as though Evelyn struggled physically while writing them. Lena took a slow breath and began reading. My dear Lena, if you are reading this, then it means I waited too long again. Lena closed her eyes briefly after the first sentence. Even now, after death, her mother sounded painfully familiar. The letter continued slowly, almost like a confession from someone who spent an entire lifetime rehearsing words she never managed to say aloud. Evelyn wrote about her childhood first, about growing up in northern Maine with a father who believed tenderness made children weak and a mother who disappeared emotionally long before she disappeared physically. Lena learned that Evelyn spent years moving between relatives after being abandoned as a teenager. Some homes were neglectful, others openly cruel. One paragraph described sleeping inside a church basement for nearly 2 months after running away at 16. No one teaches you how to love after growing up unwanted, Evelyn wrote. You only learn how to survive. Lena read each page slowly while the storm deepened outside. Evelyn admitted she spent most of adulthood terrified of emotional attachment because every person she loved eventually disappeared. When doctors diagnosed her illness years later, that fear consumed her completely. The thought of Lena watching her deteriorate physically and mentally became unbearable. According to the letter, Evelyn convinced herself there was only one way to protect her daughter from devastation. Distance. If I taught you to live without needing me, she wrote, then maybe losing me would hurt you less. Lena lowered the pages into her lap as emotion tightened painfully inside her chest. She wanted to reject the explanation immediately. She wanted to call it cowardice or emotional cruelty disguised as sacrifice. But another part of her recognized the broken logic instantly because it matched everything she had uncovered over the past several days. Evelyn Mercer did not understand love through closeness. She understood it through endurance, through sacrifice, through carrying pain privately so others might survive. Then Lena reached the line that shattered something inside her completely. Every time you hated me, I told myself it meant you were becoming strong enough to survive me. The words blurred instantly through tears Lena did not realize had begun forming. For decades, she believed her mother's silence came from indifference. But the letter revealed something far more tragic. Evelyn Mercer spent years convincing herself that her daughter's resentment was proof the plan was working. That emotional distance somehow prepared Lena for future grief. It was a terrible misunderstanding of love built by a woman who never learned emotional safety herself. And suddenly Lena understood why the house felt haunted by unfinished things. The unopened gifts, the hidden recordings, the journals, the charity work. Every piece of Evelyn's secret life carried the same desperate pattern. She loved people through actions because words terrified her. She solved suffering instead of speaking honestly about emotion. And the closer death moved toward her, the more desperately she tried leaving behind evidence that she cared. Lena continued reading through trembling hands. Several pages later, Evelyn finally explained the lighthouse project completely. The old house was never meant to remain a private residence after her death. Evelyn planned to convert the property into a permanent grief center for abandoned daughters, grieving families, and children struggling with loss. The hidden donations, bank transfers, and unfinished paperwork were all connected to that single goal. She intended to turn the Mercer house into a place where people could receive the emotional support she never learned how to give properly herself. "I thought if I built something good enough," Evelyn wrote, "maybe it would become the apology I never knew how to say." Lena covered her mouth as tears finally spilled down her face. The realization hit harder than anything else she discovered because it exposed the unbearable truth hiding beneath every mystery inside the house. Evelyn Mercer spent her entire life trying to save strangers because deep down, she never figured out how to save herself. All those years helping abandoned families and grieving children were not random acts of generosity. They were attempts to heal wounds she carried since childhood. Wounds she unknowingly passed down to her own daughter despite loving her fiercely in the only way she understood. Near the end of the letter, Evelyn mentioned the cassette recordings. "There are moments in life people never realize are precious until years later," she wrote. "I recorded the moments I was afraid I would forget first." Lena's heartbeat slowed instantly. She reached for the old cassette player beside her and searched through the tapes scattered across the table. One by one, she pressed play. On the first tape, a little girl laughed while describing a school science project. Her voice. Another recording captured a child singing badly inside a moving car, while Evelyn laughed softly in the background. Another tape held the sound of waves crashing beside distant conversation during a childhood beach trip Lena barely remembered anymore. Tape after tape revealed stolen moments Evelyn quietly preserved for years. Not strangers, not charity work. Her daughter. Lena realized with growing heartbreak that while she spent decades believing her mother barely noticed her existence, Evelyn had secretly documented tiny moments she treasured most. The recordings were fragmented and imperfect, but they proved something undeniable. Evelyn Mercer loved her daughter deeply. She simply never understood how to make that love feel safe. By the time Lena reached the final tape, her hands were shaking uncontrollably. A young version of herself whispered softly through static, "Mom." A pause followed. Then Evelyn's voice answered gently, almost tender in a way Lena had never heard before. "I'm here." That was the moment everything inside Lena finally collapsed. For years she survived through emotional numbness because numbness felt safer than disappointment. She buried grief beneath anger for so long that crying itself began feeling impossible. But sitting alone inside the hidden room while rain battered the windows outside, Lena finally allowed herself to mourn not only the mother she lost, but the relationship they never managed to have. And for the first time in decades, Lena Mercer cried. Months after Evelyn Mercer's funeral, the old house at the edge of the Vermont woods no longer looked abandoned. The cracked porch had been repaired. Fresh paint covered the faded walls. Warm light now spilled through windows that spent years dark and silent. Cars lined the gravel road almost every evening, and for the first time in decades, voices filled the property again. Children laughed in rooms once consumed by loneliness. Families sat together around long dinner tables where silence used to linger heavily between every breath. Veterans drank coffee beside the fireplace, while counselors met quietly with grieving parents down the hallway. What used to be the Mercer family home had become something entirely different. People across town simply called it the Evelyn house. Lena stood near the front entrance one cold November evening, watching a young father help his daughter hang drawings across a community room wall. She still found it strange hearing people speak warmly about the place that once held so much emotional pain for her. But over the months, something unexpected happened inside those walls. The house slowly stopped feeling haunted. The hidden room upstairs had been transformed into an archive documenting Evelyn Mercer's unfinished work. The basement storage area where unopened birthday gifts once gathered dust now held donated winter supplies for struggling families. The kitchen where Lena spent years eating in silence became the center of nightly meals shared by strangers trying to rebuild their lives after loss. And somehow, through helping complete her mother's final project, Lena began understanding grief differently too. Not as something you survive once, but something you learn to carry. The Lighthouse Project eventually reopened under the care of volunteers, therapists, churches, and local organizations inspired by Evelyn's journals. Counselors arrived weekly to support grieving children. Support groups met every Thursday night for widows, veterans, abandoned spouses, and adults carrying unresolved trauma from childhood. Some visitors stayed only an evening. Others returned every week. What mattered was that nobody walked through those doors feeling invisible anymore. That part mattered deeply to Lena, because invisibility had shaped most of her life. One afternoon during winter, Lena watched a teenage girl sitting alone near the back porch steps after a counseling session. The girl reminded her painfully of herself at that age. Quiet, guarded, carrying sadness like armor. Lena sat beside her carefully, and after several minutes of silence, the girl finally admitted she felt angry at her mother for dying. Lena understood immediately, not just the grief, the anger attached to it, the impossible confusion of loving someone who also hurt you. For years, Lena believed closure meant discovering whether Evelyn Mercer was secretly good or secretly cruel. But life rarely offers answers that clean. The truth she uncovered inside the house was far more difficult because it forced both realities to exist together. Evelyn loved deeply, and she caused damage deeply too. One truth did not erase the other. That realization became the foundation of everything the Evelyn house stood for. Not perfect healing, honest healing. Months later, a local newspaper published a story about the center, and suddenly letters began arriving from across the country. Some came from people Evelyn once helped anonymously years earlier. Others came from families struggling with grief who heard about the project online. Donations increased steadily. Volunteers offered supplies and counseling services. For the first time in Lena's life, she saw tangible proof that pain could create connection instead of isolation. But even after everything changed, some nights still felt unbearably quiet, especially inside Evelyn's old bedroom. Lena avoided sleeping there for months after reopening the house. Yet one snowy evening, while organizing remaining storage boxes from the attic, she discovered something hidden beneath old blankets inside a cedar chest near the window. It was a final unopened box smaller than the others. No labels, no dates, just a faded blue ribbon tied carefully around the top. Lena sat on the floor and opened it slowly. Inside were birthday cards, every single one her mother never gave her. Age 6, age 7, age 8, all the way through adulthood. Some cards were cheerful and awkward, others deeply emotional but unfinished. As though Evelyn stopped writing halfway, through certain thoughts she could not force herself to say aloud. Lena spent hours reading them one by one while snow drifted quietly outside the bedroom window. At age 10, Evelyn wrote, "I know you think I forget things, but I never forget you." At 16, "You looked so happy singing tonight. I stayed outside the auditorium because I thought seeing me might upset you." At 23, "I wanted to call after your graduation. I drove there twice and turned around both times." Each card revealed the same heartbreaking pattern repeated across decades. Evelyn Mercer loved her daughter constantly. She simply lacked the emotional courage to stand fully inside that love. At the bottom of the box rested one final envelope. Lena recognized her mother's handwriting instantly. She opened it carefully. Inside was a single page. "If you are reading this, it means I finally learned how to leave something behind." Lena stared at the sentence for a long time while tears slowly filled her eyes again. Because for most of Evelyn Mercer's life, she believed survival mattered more than vulnerability. She spent decades trying to protect people through sacrifice instead of honesty. And maybe that failure cost her the relationship she wanted most. But in the end, the inheritance she left behind was larger than the house itself. She left behind proof that broken people can still create something meaningful. Proof that love sometimes exists even when it arrives in damaged forms. And proof that silence inside a family can echo across generations unless somebody finally chooses to break it. Today, visitors entering the Evelyn house still pass an old framed quote hanging near the front hallway. Lena placed it there herself after finding the sentence buried inside one of Evelyn's journals. "Some people don't know how to say I love you, so they spend their entire lives trying to prove it instead." But not everyone sees Evelyn Mercer as a tragic woman trying to love the only way she understood. Some believe guilt drove everything she did. They believe the donations, the journals, the recordings, and the grief center were attempts to compensate for failing her daughter emotionally. That Evelyn spent years helping strangers because it was easier than confronting the pain she caused at home. And maybe there is truth in that too. So what do you think? Was Evelyn Mercer a loving mother, or a woman hiding behind sacrifice? As winter settled over Vermont, the Evelyn house continued filling with people carrying invisible wounds of their own. Some arrived grieving parents they never properly said goodbye to. Others came carrying decades of silence inside families that looked normal from the outside. Veterans sat beside teenagers who lost siblings. Widowers shared coffee with abandoned daughters. And every evening, as warm light poured through the windows of the old Mercer house, Lena sometimes found herself standing quietly in the hallway listening to the sound of people finally feeling heard. That sound meant more to her than she could explain. Because for most of her life, silence shaped everything. Silence at the dinner table. Silence after missed birthdays. Silence after disappointment. Silence after pain. And perhaps that was the real tragedy of Evelyn Mercer's life. Not that she failed to love her daughter, but that fear convinced her love should be hidden behind sacrifice instead of spoken aloud while there was still time. The truth is, some people spend their entire lives trying to become the opposite of the pain they survived growing up. They donate money. They rescue strangers. They carry everyone else's suffering because helping others feels easier than facing their own emotional wounds. But sometimes, in trying so hard not to repeat the past, they accidentally create new scars of their own. Lena eventually understood that her mother was neither monster nor saint, just human, deeply damaged, deeply loving, and deeply afraid. And maybe that is why this story stays with people long after it ends. Because almost everyone knows what it feels like to want love from someone who does not know how to express it properly. Sometimes parents give affection openly. Sometimes they hide it behind work, sacrifice, silence, or responsibility. And sometimes children spend half their lives misunderstanding the people who love them imperfectly. But now we want to hear from you. Did Evelyn Mercer truly love Lena? Can sacrifice ever replace emotional presence? Would you forgive a parent like this after discovering the truth? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below because stories like this often reveal how differently people define love, forgiveness, and family. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe for more human stories that reveal what people hide behind silence.